Welcome to this lesson on laboratory notebooks. The objective of this lesson is to prepare students to properly document the work that they perform in a laboratory. To achieve this objective, we will focus on three main areas. First, we'll look at some of the reasons for why we even keep laboratory notebooks. We will then move on to talk about some of the information that should be included in a lab notebook, and then we'll finish up with some maintenance issues in terms of securing your laboratory notebook and proper witnessing of a laboratory notebook. Let's start by answering an important question. Why do we even bother keeping a laboratory notebook? There are several reasons for this, the first of which is for personal reference. The laboratory notebook should contain a complete record of all of the experiments that you have performed. That means that you should be able to go back into the lab notebook and find amounts of chemicals for previous experiments or reaction times in order to design new experiments or to create reports to be given to your supervisor that summarize the work that you have done. A second reason would be for the purpose of intellectual continuity. You may find yourself being put on a project where you're taking over for somebody who is no longer part of the company, and the only access that you have to the work that was done previously is that person's lab notebook. Likewise, you may choose to leave a job for another employment opportunity, and that company will want to make sure that whoever comes in to replace you has access to all the experiments that you had performed previously. But probably the most important reason why we keep a laboratory notebook is because it serves as a legal record of the work that you do in the laboratory. And this can be absolutely crucial when it comes to things like filing for patents, or if you're working in a toxicology laboratory and you need to be able to serve as a witness for a case. So a laboratory notebook can be very, very important. In fact, the failure to keep a proper laboratory notebook could result in your termination from a job. Next, let's take a look at some of the information that should be included in your laboratory notebook. First, you want to make sure that there is some sort of an identifier. In other words, there should be a title to the experiment, or maybe some kind of a graphical representation of what the experiment is all about. This is going to then tie back to a table of contents, which we'll talk about in the next section. The identifier should also include the date that the experiment is being performed and who is performing the experiment. Next, we want to make sure that there is a purpose statement. In other words, a very succinct statement that tells the reader why you performed the experiment. This can be very handy when trying to determine what the motivation was for performing a given experiment. Next, we want to look at making sure that we include procedural information for the experiment. Now, this can be either in narrative format or it can be in list format. Largely depends upon the policies of the company that you work for. But you want to make sure that the procedure is written in such a way that a person of your skill level will be able to repeat the experiment and get the same type of results. The procedure can also be referenced back to another document. So let's say you have a procedure from a paper that you are reading. You can reference that procedure and include any changes that you may have made to that procedure in the procedure section. This is also a really good place to put information about any safety hazards in the experiment. The next thing that we want to include is a section with all of our data. This means including the raw data from the experiment, and we can also include information on the data that's been worked up. In other words, charts and graphs that you may have created that go along with the data. This is also a place where you can put sample calculations and statistical analysis. Finally, we want to have a section for a conclusion. Basically, this is a good way to document your initial reaction to the experiment that was performed, your initial analysis of the outcome. In addition to the sections that were described previously, there is some specialized information that should be included in your laboratory notebook as well. First, you want to make sure that you include any serial numbers and the names of manufacturers for any pieces of instrumentation that you may be using. That'll include things like GCs, HPLCs, AAs, or ICPs. You'll also want to include any information about the method that is being programmed into those instruments. For instance, if you're running a gas chromatography experiment, you want to make sure that you include information concerning the oven temperature, injector temperature, gas flow rates, etc. One thing that's often left out of lab notebooks is the lot and batch number information for the chemicals that were being used. This information can be invaluable when trying to troubleshoot a process that's not behaving the way it's expected to behave. So make sure that when you list the chemicals that you're using for an experiment, that you include the lot number, the batch number, and the name of the manufacturer. Finally, you want to make sure that you include all the reference information that a person might need to repeat your experiment. For instance, you may be using a company SOP, or maybe you're using a procedure that came from a journal article. In both cases, you want to make sure that anybody repeating your experiment will be able to obtain that information readily. When making entries into a laboratory notebook, there are a couple of important points that you need to keep in mind. First, you need to remember that a laboratory notebook is kept in real time. This means that the laboratory notebook is in the laboratory with you, and you're making notes in it as the experiment is proceeding. Resist the urge to put notes onto scrap pieces of paper to be incorporated into your laboratory notebook later on. The laboratory notebook need not be kept flawless. It's expected that there will be some mistakes made while you're writing in the laboratory notebook. The important thing to remember is that you do not scribble out any mistakes, but rather cross them out with a single line and then initial and date right next to it. Now, while it's not expected for your laboratory notebook to be absolutely perfect, it is expected that all your work and everything that you write in there be legible and easily understood by anybody who needs to read it. The next point to remember is that there needs to be a sense of continuity in your laboratory notebook. What this means is that there should not be any empty spaces, and you should always write on both sides of the page. If for some reason you need to leave a page empty, or you need to leave a large gap in your laboratory notebook, it's important that you draw a line through that area and initial and date to show that you intended to leave that space blank. Also, it's important that you make sure that you keep the pages organized. In other words, if you need to start 2 experiments on the same day, you may find yourself having to put a single experiment onto non-consecutive pages. In this case, simply make notes on the page about which page you're going to continue onto or which page that work had continued from. The final point to remember is that you will be held accountable for whatever you write in your laboratory notebook. Remember, this is a legal document. So you want to make sure that all of your entries are made in pen, specifically in non-erasable ink. You want to make sure that you never ever use whiteouts, and you also want to make sure that you sign the bottom of each page and date it. This is especially important when you're doing work that might be patented. Additionally, you should have your work witnessed on a daily basis by one of your coworkers. So at the bottom of each one of the pages of your laboratory notebook, you should make sure there's a space for you to sign and date, as well as one of your coworkers. Thank you for watching this short video on laboratory notebooks. It's now expected that in all of your coursework and all your laboratory work, that you will hold to the standards that were described in this video.